Good to see everybody this morning. I'd like to open to the book of Hebrews, where we're going to be starting in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 3. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 3. And we're asking the question this morning of how do we know that there is a God? And there's a lot of answers to that question, and we could probably go around and all give a different reason, and probably there's that many reasons or ways that we can know that there is a God. But I'd like to consider that three different examples this morning from the book of Hebrews of how do we know that there is a God. And we start in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 3. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 3, which says, "By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible." And in other words, it's the idea that you can't see who made the world. And so you look out and you say, well, where did this all come from? And there's nothing visible you can lay your eyes on and say, well, that's where it all came from. It's something that we can't see. And if it's something that we can't see, then it requires a degree of what he calls faith or belief. Now, certainly, if you look at Hebrews 11, he's not saying that it's a blind thing, kind of a jump in the dark. I sure hope that someone made all of this. He says that there's evidence. There's reasons to look out and say, if I piece all the clues together, it must be so. It's obviously so. Somebody made all of this. And so I'd like to think about that for just a moment. And I kind of like to think about it from one example. If you look at humanity, what you find over and over again is that we all have a sort of innate need to worship. That it's kind of put into us. Somebody put into us this innate desire to worship something. And so, like we said, there's a whole lot of different ways that we could look at how we know there's a God. And I just want to look at this one small slice of that pie for a moment. That there's this innate desire within humanity to worship. There's a man named Alden Bass, and he wrote a book called Monotheism and the Origin of Religion. And this is what he said. He said, this desire to worship, it holds true for all the ancient people, the ancient Chinese, the ancient Native Americans, the Australian Aborigines, the Bushmen in the Congo, as well as the better documented civilizations of the Old World, that as far back as we have recorded history, you find people worshiping. You move forward into a more modern context, and you see that even people who claim to have no faith in anything, they still worship something. Now, they may not call it that, but when you compare it, at the end of the day, it's really the exact same thing, that they're worshiping something. In the 2nd century, there was a Christian named Justin Martyr, and he was trying to convince the Greeks that all of the gods they worshiped was really their effort to worship the one true God. That's what they were trying to do, even though they didn't know it. And so he quoted their own poets, saying there's one and universal King, of whom are all things, and ourselves are sprung. In other words, their own poets admitted that they thought that there was one origin of everything, that everything came from something. And so you look back down the pages of history, and people have pointed to this over and over again. There's a professor of ancient history, and this is what he had to say about it. He said, historical survey has shown us that in early times, everywhere, or at least almost everywhere that we can find, belief in the unity of God existed. So there's the barbarian nations possessed it, as well as the civilized one. When he says unity of God, he means that there is just one God. That really, the farthest back that we can find, the first peoples in historical records didn't worship multiple gods. They worshiped one God. And, a lot of scientists will say, well, the idea of one God kind of came from the worship of many gods, that originally people worshiped the birds and the sun and the moon and all these things. And then eventually someone said, it would make more sense if there was just one God. But that the records actually show that first, people just worshiped one God. And then they began to branch into worshiping other things and more gods. And so that's really the opposite of what people anticipate. But doesn't it fit really well with what the Bible says about how people came to worship and to be? And then there's another man, he's a Sir, he must be important, I guess, Sir Flinders Langford, Sir Flinders Partee. He's the father of Egyptology, and he says this. He says, were the conception of a god only an evolution from such spirit worship, that is, spirit of multiple gods, we should find the worship of many gods preceding the worship of one God. But, he says, monotheism is the earliest stage traceable in theology. That all the way back, the very first thing we can see, people worshipped one God first. And then finally, I like this one because this guy, Stephen Langdon from Oxford, he doesn't believe in God, and he doesn't want this to be true. And that's what he says. He says, I really thought I would find that people worshipped multiple gods first. I really thought that this was not true. But when I look at the evidence, I just have to admit, he says, I may falter to carry the conviction in concluding that in the oldest religions, monotheism predates polytheism. And so while the world will tell you, well, people first, they were primitive, they weren't as smart as us, and so they just worshiped the birds and the grass and the trees, and then eventually we got more smart and we started talking about somebody in the sky. The world may tell us that's the case. The truth is, what all of the evidence points to, even people who don't believe it have to admit, people first in the historical records worshipped one God. And that's exactly what you would expect for the Bible to find, because that's exactly what the Bible says. You go back to Genesis chapters 9 and 10, Noah had 3 sons, and they all knew one God. That's all that they knew. And they worshiped this one God. And then as it begins to describe their descendants, you see how their descendants began to break off and worship multiple gods. But right from the very beginning, this is exactly what the Bible describes. You think Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and in verse 11, Solomon describes there this kind of idea of an innate desire in all of us to seek a God and to worship him. In Ecclesiastes 3:11, he says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts. And he has put within us this desire to seek something more than this life, to seek something more than the temporary and the physical and the seen world. Hebrews 11:3 says, by faith, by looking at the evidence, we understand something that we can't see made all of this. And that really, it was put into our hearts, into our consciousness, into who we are, to look for that, to seek it out, to find what that is, to find whatever it is that allows us to live longer than this lifetime exists for, that we are seeking. And then a part of that seeking is this innate desire to submit to whoever that is, to worship whoever that is. You look at the world, people today, they worship all kinds of things. Some people worship money. Some people worship their cell phones. You think, well, what do you spend the most time kind of bowing down? Everyone has this little hump on the back of their neck because they're always looking down at their cell phones, right? And it's not wrong to look down at your cell phone, but if you hold it up here, it does help, right? There's something. Some people just worship themselves. You think, what are they most obsessed with? What do they spend all of their time pampering and trying to prevent aging? And none of those things in and of themselves are wrong, but it can become to a place, right, where anything can become an object of worship. There's a lot of things that people are worshiping today, but you know what they're looking for? Ecclesiastes 3:11 says they're looking for eternity. And they're looking for the one who is in eternity. And it's such a blessing to be here and to know we have found the one who is in eternity. And that this morning, in this moment, we can worship him as we were created to. There's something so satisfying about worship because we were made to worship. People who don't worship, deep down, they're not content and satisfied people, because we have this desire. And that's why they do more and more and more and more of whatever it is that they are worshiping, because it's like, throwing small tiny things into a God-sized hole. You can't fill that up with things. But we get to be here and we get to worship our God because we've looked at the evidence and we've said there is a God and he's worth worshiping. And so this is one way, the one very small way that we can look at the world around us and with faith, because of the evidence, say there is a God. The second thing I'd like to look at is in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4. Hebrews chapter 3 and in verse 4, where the Hebrews writer is making an argument about Christ, the Christ being greater than Moses, and therefore we should listen to him. and no longer do we follow the law of Moses. But he says in verse 4, as he's explaining this, he says, Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4, for every house is built by someone, right? That's going to be one of the most obvious statements that the Bible's ever made, isn't it? You look at a house and you think somebody built that. Nobody looks at a house and thinks, I wonder how that grew there. Well, except for, which chain is it? Is it the Dollar Generals or they seem to just grow out of nowhere. There's that if you have a pile of dirt, they'll just grow there. But otherwise, all the buildings in the world, somebody put them there, right? They have to come from somewhere. Every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. The universe is just like a giant house, in essence. It's just like a big structure. There's all these things in the universe. If somebody built the house that we can see, somebody must have built the big house too. And so this is just sort of reasoning. It's reasoning through things and saying, if it's here, somebody put it here. And this is, you see a cobweb, spider webs. They're so amazing, aren't they? They're so intricate in their detail. They're something that has spent time creating this pattern that's beautiful and also useful for their livelihood. If you see the cobweb and you can kind of see the remains of that pattern and you think, that's so beautiful, something put that there. If you've never seen a spider build one before and you didn't know where it came from, you would still know that didn't just grow like that. Something put it there. You see a road, right? You can tell a lot of things about the person who built the road just by looking at the road, can't you? You have really nice roads and you think they're straight and they're smooth and you ride on them and it's not bumpy and you think, this was a smart guy who built this road. And then you've got some other roads that, I don't even need to describe it. You all just picture one in your mind right now, I'm sure, and you think, what dummy built this road? You can tell a lot of things about the person who built the road just by riding on it. But you see the road and you know that somebody of varying degrees of intelligence built that road. You look at the universe, you know something that somebody built it, but more than that, you know something about who built it. Because you look at how it all comes together and it tells you something about his intelligence, his wisdom, his power. Now, I'd like to think about this from the perspective, specifically, of numbers. You think how the numbers show us that there is a creator, that somebody made all of this. You think, what are numbers? Numbers are, first of all, they're innate to our senses, right? It's something that we just kind of understand, maybe not how to put them together, right? Math can be hard, but just the idea of numbers is kind of innate to our senses. When our children were about 2 or so, before they were really fully counting, they didn't have to know how to count to be able to group things into, they could take their toys and make groups of 3 and 3 and 3, and sometimes nobody told them to do it, you would just watch them. They would begin to group things into these numbers. And you watch children, small children who don't count yet, they don't understand how numbers work, they still do things sometimes in an organized, patterned way because numbers are just innate to our senses. We just understand. There's something about the way that the world, the universe is made, that it can be organized. We don't have to know math to see how that works. Numbers are concrete. And that's, 2 plus 2 is always 4. And that never changes. And you think, if some of the people who build roads made the universe, 2 plus 2 would sometimes be 4, but sometimes it'd be 5, and you wouldn't be able to keep up with it, right? But it never changes. It's solid, it's firm. Somebody who knew what they were doing put all of that together. Numbers are infinite, right? So I had to look this up. I'm not like a math whiz or anything, but the highest number that anyone has named so far, they call it the Googleplex. Google, not Google, right? Google, Googol, Googleplex. Google is 10 with 100 zeros after it. So if you feel like counting really high one day, if you can count to 10 with 100 zeros after it, they call that a Google. But even bigger than that is the Googleplex, right? The Googleplex is 10 with the Google after it, and it just keeps going and going and going, right? I don't even know exactly how big that number is. It just kind of blows my mind. My point is, that's just the biggest number we've counted to. We will never reach the end of numbers. No one will ever say, I found it. I found the last number. It doesn't get any bigger than this. Numbers are infinite. They just keep going on forever and ever and ever. It tells us something about the one who made the numbers. He's infinite. He just goes on forever and ever and ever. You look into him, it's kind of like, you ever do Bible study and you've read a passage 100 times and you read that passage again and you find something you didn't see there before, a layer that you've uncovered that doesn't change what it means, but it does give you a little more depth and understanding of like, oh, how did I miss this? His word is as infinite as he is. Numbers show us just how infinite. Someone who can create infinite numbers can't be smaller than that. He must be bigger than that. Numbers, of course, are useful. We maybe don't like that sometimes, but they're useful. You can count and add, you can multiply, you can organize. They're useful for our finances, for our schedules. Numbers, we use them all the time. Right in the beginning, isn't that what God did? He said, let there be light. And then he organized that light into day and night. And then he said, this is the first day. Numbers are created in that moment. God used them to organize, and we do that too. And numbers in and of themselves are beautiful. There's no music without numbers. And you just ask Dave about timing and things like that. All of the music that we listen to, that we enjoy, that we worship with, that we sing, at their core, it's just numbered patterns all coming together in a really beautiful sound. There's no music without numbers. And now that we have computers, some people make these sort of calculations that are long and complicated, and I couldn't tell you what they mean, but they put the calculations into the computers, and the computers are able to take them and create art with them, and they are these infinite and complex and beautiful, just sort of weaving together of lines and shapes and things that are just stunning to look at, but it's all based on the way that numbers work. Numbers create beautiful things. And so you think, whoever created these numbers, he's highly intelligent, he's wise, he's consistent, he's faithful, he's infinite, he's given us something useful, and he must be beautiful beyond our wildest imagination. Numbers reveal a lot about the one who created us. And third then, the last thing I want to look at is found in Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3. Just a piece of it, really. In Hebrews 1, it says, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in the past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, right? In the Old Testament, he spoke through the prophets, but now he speaks through Jesus. And he tells us some things about the Son. He says, whom he has appointed heir of all things, who he made the worlds, and that goes back to Genesis 1, who, being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. That Jesus is sort of the battery that keeps the universe running. He's the glue that holds it all together. Jesus keeps us all here and keeps gravity working so we don't float off into outer space. And he keeps it all running in perfect order. And that's just a piece of what he does. But I'd like to take that big idea and zoom in really far. If you brought your microscope this morning, you might find it useful. So look at the atom. Because the atom, tiny as it is, can't see it without some kind of camera to zoom way in. The atom shows us in great degree what God is, who he is and what he's capable of upholding, what he's capable of doing. And so there's a doctor, Dr. John Cleveland Cothran. He's a mathematician and a chemist. The thing that I was reading called him a distinguished mathematician and chemist. I don't know exactly what that means. I didn't put that part here, but that's what they say about him. And he says each atom consists of exactly the same three kinds of particles, right? And we don't have to worry about what all those are, but you might be familiar with protons and electrons and neutrons. And he says all of these things and the electrons, they spin around and they revolve at relatively great distances from the center, rather reminiscent of a miniature, right, a tiny, tiny miniature solar system. So you look at the solar system and you have the sun at the center and the planets are all orbiting around it, and it's very consistent, isn't it? We can tell you exactly where Jupiter is going to be in the sky at any point. Well, I can't tell you, but somebody out there can tell you at any point in time exactly where Jupiter is going to be, because all of those things just stay on track always. And they don't really surprise us as far as we understand them. It says if we could zoom in and all look together at our atoms, we would see it's just like that. There is a center, a sun in the middle of it, and then all these little planets that just orbit in perfect harmony, and they just keep orbiting no matter what. And you think, it's amazing to think that God could create the universe that's this big, and then also a universe that's so tiny that we can't even see it. He could do both, and they would be the same. What are the odds that that pattern could be repeated on such a large scale and such a tiny scale simultaneously? He continues, and he says, our logical and inescapable conclusion, this is the only thing that you can say if you believe that, if you see that, is not only that creation occurred, but that it was brought about according to the plan and will of a person endowed with supreme intelligence and knowledge, and the power to bring it about and keep it running according to plan, always and everywhere throughout the universe, right? So this is a guy who's teaching this in some university somewhere in a science department. He says, the only conclusion that I can come to is somebody put this together and is still holding it together. That's the only thing that makes sense when you look at the universe at large and when you look at a tiny atom. He says that they spin, these things are spinning at almost the speed of light. Right? Your atoms, as tiny as they are, right? Some of you talk a lot about how much slower you're getting all the time, and you feel like you're barely getting around because you got aches and pains, but your atoms are running at almost the speed of light, even as you're moving like a turtle, you know. That's how fast that those little cells are inside of you. Unfathomable, isn't it? That the planets are moving quickly, and it looks slow, but they move relatively quick for planets, and your atoms are moving quickly, and all of this is going in the same pattern. He says, that has to be a creator. And it doesn't matter where you look. You can look up, you can look down. You can look within you, you can look without you. You can look at things you can see, or you can look at abstract concepts like numbers and music. You can look anywhere. And this is just 3 small examples. So we could have spent 10 years or more just going over example after example after example of all of the evidence that's out there. It doesn't matter where you look. There are no holes. It's always the same conclusion. There is a God. But more than there is a God, that's a basic start. More than there is a God, isn't he magnificent? Isn't he something special? Isn't he something so much bigger and majestic and holy and glorious and wonderful than we could ever even fathom? You know, I love to study the Bible. Y'all know that about me. I get too excited about things that nobody else cares about. I love to study the Bible, and it shows us so much about who God is. But sometimes I like to step back and just read something about science or history or something from these other areas of study, because you know what they do? If they're done right, if they're true, they show us who God is. Now, they don't tell us his will for us entirely. They can't tell us how to be saved. They can't tell us important things that only the Bible can tell us, but they can show us great things about who God is. In Romans chapter 2, Paul describes how before the Gentiles had a law, they still could be righteous before God because they could listen to their consciences and get, not with perfect accuracy, but a degree of knowing what was right and wrong. A degree of knowing what was right and wrong. Romans 1, he says the reason for that is, and we'll read that one. Let's go back to Romans 1. Romans chapter 1. He says, the reason why that is verse 20, since the creation of the world, this has always been true, his invisible attributes, right? The things, not just God himself, but things about God, that he's faithful, that he's righteous, that he's glorious, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Right? That's an ironic statement, that something invisible can be clearly seen. How can you see something invisible? Because there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence. It's clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, that's you and me, even his eternal power, even his Godhead, so that they are without excuse. They had a degree of understanding of what was right, what was wrong, because they could look at the world around them and say, this tells me something about God. When I think about numbers, that tells me about his infiniteness, his beauty, his faithfulness, because they never change. When I look at anything, I can find some truth about not just that he is, but who he is. The world around us is full of examples everywhere. And that's because God has given us all these clues. You think, what is the universe for? It's for several things, but one of the primary things it's there for is to always remind us of God. That we should be able to look at anything, and we should be able to train ourselves to think through and recognize something about God's nature. And we can always go back to the Bible and say, does that match what the Bible says? And if we've reasoned through it correctly, it will. We can train ourselves to see God everywhere we look. And Paul says we walk by faith and not by sight, because we can't see God. But a part of how we walk by faith is by learning to see God in the things that can be seen. That it can be clearly seen, although it is invisible, because there is a God, and he has made himself known to us. He's always made himself known to us through creation. He has today made himself known in the most clear picture possible through the life that Jesus lived and the record of it that's found in the Bible. And he has told us everything that we need to know. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3 and 4 says everything we need to know for life, how to live, how to make decisions, how to keep moving forward, and for godliness, how to become more like him, how to make the right choices, how to be faithful to him. Everything we need to know is found in that word. And so this morning, if there's any way that we can help you to grow your faith, whether that's to step into the waters of baptism and receive the salvation that he offers, not because we're taking a blind leap into the dark, but because the evidence both in the Bible and in the world and the universe are just so overwhelming, or if it's to pray for you or counsel you, to love you, to help you, to hold your hand or give you a hug, whatever it is that you need. We ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.